All right, welcome everybody to another installment of our Open Game Data Open Office Hours. And so for anybody who might be new either to the recording or to the session, just want to reiterate some of and reintroduce kind of what we do here. So the Open Game Data Community is a NSF-funded research incubator trying to bring together a collective of researchers that are interested in using data that's generated from within and around games to advance our scientific understanding of thinking, learning, decision-making, things that humans do. And we have two primary goals. One is to compile a set of resources and best practices and sort of convene this community, and these open office hours are one of the ways we do that. And then also our long-term goal is going to be to build tangible research infrastructure that helps us actually do this kind of stuff and this kind of work together. We have a bunch of resources already. So the Open Game Data website is hosted at Field Day Games from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And has a bunch of resources, has a bunch of examples of games that are sharing data and people are playing. And then we also have a Slack channel that we use to coordinate and talk to each other and share ideas and resources.